Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am pleased to be moderating our first session as well as welcome you to our Managing Cloud Costs in 2023 Expert Advice Summit, brought to you by Zerto and Lacework. The editorial staff of RedmondMag.com, Virtualization and Cloud Review, and AWSinsider.net have worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts for this topic, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these three great sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You will receive an email when the replay is available within the next few days. Next, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. During today's third session, we will be giving away a $500 American Express gift card, but you must be present to win. So be sure to stay on for the entire event. Also, we do have resources from our sponsors Zerto and Lacework available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of Zerto and Lacework's underwriting of this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for sponsoring and supporting the community and ask you check out these resources so we can bring you more events like this in the future. And finally, please check out the Resource Center for more information on our upcoming Live 360 training conference in Orlando this November. With over 170 sessions and 16 hands-on labs, this conference brings the IT, developer, data, and cybersecurity communities together for real-world practical information on a wide range of Microsoft and other products, technologies, and solutions. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Enterprise Cloud Costs, Best Practices to Close Out 2023. This session features Elias Kneser, Chief of Research at EK Media Group. Elias is a thought leader in the area of cloud computing and digital disruption. Until recently, Elias was Research Vice President at Gartner, where he spent 7 years focusing on private, hybrid, and public cloud computing. Today, Elias continues to conduct research and advice and engage customers and vendors on all aspects of cloud, edge, and data center transformation strategies. He is well known for his ability to simplify complex technical concepts and explain how IT aligns with and forwards business goals. Take it away, Elias.
Thank you, Chris, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. It's a privilege. Thank you for the opportunity. If you'd like to connect on social media, and if you like this type of content, I publish regularly on YouTube, so make sure you follow me. Hopefully you'll find this session informative. It's the cumulative of everything that I've talked to customers about over the years, and hopefully we can have a discussion in the Q&A. So the first thing that I want to start with is that cost optimization is not a one and done. You have to have a mindset of continuous optimization. Continuous optimization because your cloud project, your cloud estate is always changing. It's always evolving. And as a result, this has to be weaved into the culture, into the ops culture, the operational culture. It's part of what you do. It's not something that should be dedicated to a single person to sit there day in and day out and take a look at whether or not the price has shifted by a couple of cents here or a couple of cents there and try to move from one provider to another. However, part of the design, part of the architecture, part of the operation of your cloud environment, cost optimization should be part of what you're doing on an ongoing basis. Now, the other thing that I want to advise you, do not obsess over cost. In IT, over the last 30 or 40 or 50 years, we've made cost an obsession. We're always trying to cut the budget, sometimes even when no one's asking us to. I've never been in an organization or talked to a CIO or a VP that wasn't tight on budget. They're always trying to cut the budget. While it's important to be cost aware, you also should recognize the cost is not just your responsibility. You're not taking this money, right? You are investing this money on behalf of your business to give them a service that they can use as a competitive advantage. So not obsessing over cost is crucial. And if you find yourself in a position where you're always defending yourself, defending how much you're spending, then that should be a signal to you that there's somewhere business and IT are not aligned. And I know you've heard the idea of convert IT from a cost center to a revenue center. That's something popular. It's something we always tell customers. But the question is how. Now, the how of this is your job is to make business and technology indistinguishable. In today's world, technology is how your business is going to compete and win. You are the differentiator. When the business understands this, you're able to communicate all of the spending and where it's going. You're able to, again, make them indistinguishable so that they understand, hey, you're not spending this money because we have a project in IT. We don't have, and there are no IT projects. There are only business projects. I've seen other CIOs give up the budget. They basically say, I don't want a budget in IT. We're going to put the budget within the different departments, and whenever you want something from IT, you will pay for it. So there are different ways of, again, transforming IT from being a cost center as it is viewed today to being a revenue-generating center. One of them is to essentially, this was for a large grocery supermarket chain in the U.S., where the CIO literally gave up the budget and said, if you want something from us, you will pay for it, and we will bill you and support you. So this is one way of converting IT from being a cost to a revenue generator. So as we're going through this, as you're thinking about how to close out 2023, as you're having conversations with your team, if you find yourself constantly defending what you're spending, then it is time to have a conversation with the business, or you're not communicating well enough the value of technology, the differentiator that you're bringing to the table. That being said, let's start off with some best practices. Now, the first one is make sure that you're using the right discount models. Whenever I say this to folks, they tend to say, well, obviously, until I start showing the different models, the different discount models that each of the cloud provider offers. I'm not going to go into each of these in great detail. I simply want to highlight them so that if you find something on this screen that you're potentially not using, you should be using it, you should be exploring it. And what we're starting with is what AWS offers. So if you're not using reserved instances for your EC2, if you're not using it for RDS, if you're not using it for Elasticache, for DynamoDB, whatever the case might be, if you're not leveraging reserved instances, then you're wasting an opportunity for cost cutting potentially or cost optimization within your cloud estate. The same thing for savings plans. It's the ability to, again, leverage the hours per week or per month that you need as opposed to just taking something on a 24-hour basis. Here you're going to this is more of an art than a science. So as you're starting to compound these savings plans on top of one another, it will take some tweaking before you get the right formula. But the idea is these are available to you. If you're not in any form of an enterprise discount program with AWS, it is worth exploring with your account executive. Oftentimes, customers will not use spot instances, or they will overlook spot instances. Sometimes they don't understand spot instances. Spot instances is your ability to acquire a large number of compute instances at a significantly reduced price. So what happens is these cloud providers, AWS, Azure, Google, and others, they'll have unused capacity. And in order for them to put this capacity to use, they will put it out in the market and allow you to bid on it. Now, spot instances have a lot of benefits because you're acquiring a lot of CPU or GPU for significantly reduced prices, but they come with caveats. Sometimes if someone outbids you, you will lose access to a number of instances. So make sure that you're using that for the right workload. But the idea is you have all of these things at your disposal that you should be taking advantage of. And then we come to Microsoft. Now, anyone that says they understand Microsoft discount programs properly, it's clear it hasn't been properly explained to them. No, I'm joking. But Microsoft has so many of these, right? And because they've been around for so long, these tend to compound, and sometimes leveraging multiples of these is going to yield significant benefits, especially when you look at enterprise agreements and customer agreements. You'll be able to leverage your other Microsoft licenses, whether it's on premises or at the edge, combined with what you're potentially using with Azure. Those will yield credits, they will yield training, they will yield consulting services sometimes, and they will yield lower costs. Now, again, you will need an advisor to navigate you through all of the capabilities that Microsoft offers, but it's certainly something that you should be looking into and taking advantage of. And then I'm going to stop as far as the cloud providers with Google. All of them, Oracle and IBM, Alibaba, and others have these discount programs, but I wanted to highlight the top three. And of the top three, I think you'll find that Google Cloud would be one of the cloud providers that you can really push them as far as the discount programs are concerned, because they've been in the number 3 position for a while. They're trying to capture more market share. They're more flexible in terms of your negotiation with Google Cloud. So take advantage of it. They also offer the sustained use, which I really like. It's the more you use the cloud, the more benefits and discounts you get. So I really like what they offer there. But if you're not using these and others, you're missing out. You're leaving money on the table. Make sure you revisit that. Now, another thing that's kind of piggybacks on top of what we've been talking about with regards to the discount program, specifically the reserved instances, is scheduled resources, or scheduled instances for that matter. Oftentimes you'll find that you need workloads you need them for a specific time of the week or a specific time of the month. So instead of reserving 24/7 type of reserved instances, you're able to schedule something so that you're only using it at a specific time during the month or at a specific time during the week. And you're able to pay for that ahead of time, and as a result, that will also yield discounts. So again, I'm highlighting all of these to show you that there are different ways of doing this, and that yes, in the beginning this will be a little overwhelming. It'll take you a little bit of time to kind of navigate your way through. But once you get the hang of this, once you've got things on a set basis, you'll be able to optimize it continuously a lot better. Now we move on to right-sizing and upgrading instances. This one, on the one side, it's kind of obvious. On the other side, not a lot of folks will take into account that sometimes upgrading an instance will yield cost benefits as well. So let's start with right-sizing. You always want to be monitoring your instances, your virtual machines, and finding opportunities to right-size them. It is normal when we're deploying something, when we're designing or architecting something, to oversize it, whether it's the memory, whether it's the CPU, whether it's the storage, especially the storage. That's normal. But 6 months into something, you'll have enough data to be able to go back and say, do I need this configuration? Now, sometimes you're going to have your application folks, your line of business folks, your developers. Developers need superheroes. Make sure you're that superhero for them. That will require or that will request resources based on what they know, or maybe based on what the creator of the application is saying they need. However, what you can do is you can fight the data. So if 6 months is not enough, let's push that out to 9 months. 9 months in or a year in, you'll have very good data as far as the application and say, look, you've requested 32 gig of memory, but over the course of a year, you've never gone over 16 gig. So we are going to right-size this application because we're able to save this much money. So you're essentially putting them on the spot because you're coming to them with data. You're also showing the cost savings. Now, at that point, if you're presenting them with all of this and they still insist on keeping it, then you again have transformed IT from being a cost center to a revenue center. You've done your job. You've presented the data. They're paying for it. You've done all you can. Now, as far as upgrading the instances, a lot of times these cloud providers will want to move customers off of old instances that they might want to retire, and as a result, they'll offer incentives on these upgraded instances. Sometimes there is an energy benefit, again, out of upgrading to an instance. It'll be more energy efficient. If you're trying to meet certain sustainability goals, for example, upgrading the instance might give you a little more ammo, a little more data so that you're able to present this as a play on sustainability as well. And again, as you're upgrading, of course, the cloud provider that's offering these more energy efficient instances is also contributing to sustainability. So there's benefits there that you can also take into account as you're thinking about why upgrade the instance if you don't need to. Now, number 4 is investing in third-party optimization tools. Now, of all of the tools available in cloud, I would say optimization tools is the one tool that I would say absolutely go with third party. This is not to say that native cloud providers don't have excellent tools. They do. And one of the things that I'm always accused of is I don't mention specific tools. So today I'm going to mention specific tools, but I'm not going to suggest which one is better. I will let you do that through your testing. But if you're not using or not leveraging the native tools, that's a great place to start, because some of those are free, some of those you have to pay a little bit for. But what that allows you to do is it allows you to kind of understand what you need from a tool. Start to build the criteria. I can give you a lot of criteria that you should be looking out for when you're selecting tools. But no matter how many I give you, until you start using it and understand what your needs are and start to build your own criteria, nothing will matter. So if you're on an AWS, for example, I would say make sure you're using CloudWatch. Make sure you're using Cost Explorer. Make sure you're leveraging Trusted Advisor. You've got a free version of Trusted Advisor, and you've got a paid version of Trusted Advisor. These are tools that are available to you that will help you understand your AWS estate very well. As far as Azure is concerned, you've got Azure Cost Management and Billing, it's a very good tool. It's a very effective tool. Make sure you use it. Google also has Google Cloud Cost Management. These are the native tools, the native capabilities. You should be using them. As far as third party is concerned, Cloudability is available, Flexera is available, VMware Cloud Health is available. There is a ton of tools out there that you can leverage as far as cost optimization. My advice and some of the criteria that I would suggest that you always take into account when you're selecting any third-party tool, but cost optimization in particular, is use it and make sure that it supports multi-cloud. So make sure whatever tool that you're buying has the same feature parity for AWS, for Azure, and potentially for Google, depending on what your multi-cloud is. And for those of you that are maybe at this point, maybe not multi-cloud, my advice is choose a multi-cloud tool, even if you are not multi-cloud today. Multi-cloud has become a default. It's a matter of when. It's a matter of how. It's no longer a matter of if. So even if you're not using it, invest in a tool that will give you feature parity across 2 or 3 cloud providers at least. And my advice to you, again, if you're not multi-cloud, let's say you're on AWS or you're on Azure, identify the second or the third cloud provider today, even if you're not planning on operationalizing that provider today. Select them, because by selecting them, you are then able to make decisions as far as these optimization tools based on, hey, I know I'm going to use Azure in the future, or Google in the future, or Oracle in the future. So these tools will help you to continuously optimize the environment. They will alert you. They will give you suggestions on instances or past services potentially that you are not using properly, maybe reserved instances that you're not taking into account. So this is one of those really good investments in tools, would be your cloud cost optimization tools. Now, number 5 is designed with cloud optimization in mind. Now, those of you that know me, or those of you that have followed some of the stuff I talk about this a lot. But how do we put this in practice? Now, this comes into play a couple of different ways. The first thing is to have a different mindset. What you don't want to do is take everything that you've learned on premises and apply that in the cloud. The last thing you want to do is do just a strict lift and shift. Now, I'm not saying you're not going to be doing a lift and shift in the cloud. Some workloads, there's no way around it. You have to do a lift and shift. But even when you're doing lift and shift, there are ways to optimize this workload that you're moving. I'll give you basic examples. If you've got a web server farm on premises that consists of 20 web servers, you can certainly take 20 web servers and move them onto an AWS, an Azure, a Google, or an Oracle. But at that point, there is no cost optimization. You've really not touched the environment. You've just moved it from one location to another. I'm not really sure why you would expect any cost savings for that matter. It's actually going to cost you a little more, maybe a little bit less, but in the grand scheme of things, you're not really doing anything to this application. Now, instead of doing that, instead of moving just 20 web servers from point A to point B, if you have a different mindset, a cloud mindset, you would potentially create an auto-scaling group on any of the cloud providers and maybe deploy 3 instances in that auto-scaling group. And then based on your policy, based on the automation that you put around it, if the CPU utilization hits 60%, I'm going to deploy 3 more servers. If the memory utilization hits 80%, I'm going to deploy 2 more servers. If my CPU utilization drops, I'm going to remove servers. By doing that, you are optimizing the workload. Another example would be, instead of moving, for example, the workload and its third-party load balancer to the cloud, maybe move the workload and use the native load balancing services. By using the native load balancing services, you are saving across the board, right? You're saving on that licensing cost that's going to be very expensive from a third-party provider. You're also saving on operation. You are no longer responsible for making that load balancer highly available, for scaling the load balancer, for patching the load balancer. You're simply consuming it as a service. So you're refactoring your application by leveraging native services. The same thing can be said about databases. If part of your workload is moving a SQL database, for example, instead of moving the SQL inside of a virtual machine and putting it on Azure, or on AWS, or on Google, leverage manage as a service capabilities, whether it's RDS from AWS, whether it's Azure SQL from Microsoft. Leveraging these is going to, again, reduce the cost of not only the license, but also reduce the cost of operating it and managing it. Now, some of you are saying, Eli, why not adopt a DevOps mindset, or why not adopt DevOps? Now, that's a fair question. I would say adopting the DevOps principles is the right thing to do. The problem that we've always had with DevOps is that organizations had made DevOps into a thing. You start to hear about DevOps engineers and DevOps teams. DevOps was not intended ever to be a thing. DevOps is a mindset. DevOps is a culture. DevOps is about collaboration and communication. DevOps' problem is that there's no delineation of responsibility between different teams. So you end up having the IT teams or the operations teams and the developer teams stepping on each other. And then you have the IT leadership that also doesn't know kind of where their limits are. Now, the way to solve for that is to adopt a platform team. Some will call this a platform ops, like I have on the screen. Others will call this a platform engineering team. Some will just call it a platform team. But adopting a platform team, and that platform team should own the budget. And part of the responsibilities of this platform team is to adopt FinOps capabilities. Now, I put FinOps in here specifically because there's also conversation in the industry today as far as, do we need a dedicated FinOps team? Now, yours truly believes that the answer is no. You need the FinOps capabilities to be part of the ops team, but you don't necessarily need a dedicated FinOps team. Again, you haven't needed a dedicated FinOps team for the last 50 years. Why do we need it in the cloud today? And what would a FinOps team focus on day in and day out? There's not enough to keep them busy. You're not going to cloud cost optimize every hour of the day. So this should be part of what the ops team does. The ops team understands the entire process. Part of the design process cost should be taken into account. Part of managing it, cost should be taken into account. So giving this to the platform ops team makes the most sense because they're the ones designing it. They're the ones operating it and supporting it. And as a result, they should own the budget. They should be held responsible for it. And when you make someone accountable for the budget, own the budget, they will find ways to optimize so that they stay within budget. And think about it this way. When you have a chef in a restaurant, they build a menu and they know the ingredients and how they're going to put the ingredients together to meet the budget that the investors of that restaurant have given them. So when you start this, they're going to basically say, I can give you a budget of $10,000 a week, for example. Now the chef has to figure out how to hire within that $10,000 and how to get the right ingredients to meet the budget, and as a result, they create a menu. The same thing for the platform ops team. The platform ops team owns a budget, and within that budget, they have to be able to develop the application, maintain the application, and support the application. So it makes sense. The platform ops team will also have the right mindset, they will have the right skill set, they will have the right training to manage this environment. And not only that, your platform ops team can then replicate these capabilities across not one, but multiple cloud providers like we talked. Everything that you do, you should take into account multi-cloud as part of the conversation. And just to highlight some of the things that a FinOps mindset or a FinOps culture, some of the responsibilities, some of the things that they would be responsible for. All of the things that you see on the screen here would be part of what this platform team, this platform ops team would be doing. Again, We're going to go through things like, cost allocation, your data analysis and showed back, your forecasting, the workload management and automation, managing shared costs. So how do I take something that maybe this application is sharing costs with another application? All of these things have to be broken down. But you can't expect someone that is only responsible for doing FinOps to understand all of these things. The only team that would understand how all of these things work is the team that's developing and maintaining the application, which is why I keep coming back to where it makes the most sense to put something like this would be within your platform team, within the platform ops team. Now, number 6 is cost governance and policies. Now, when we're talking about cost governance in particular and policies, there's a ton that you can do there. You can certainly also set a budget for your team. Your platform ops team can have a budget, should have a budget. You can enable things like tagging so that you are able to enforce tagging across the environment. Why is tagging important? Tagging is important because when we talk later about chargeback and showback, you'll be able to generate reports based on tags that you've associated with assets in your cloud. So one of the things that I always advise customers to do is the first thing to do is enable a tagging policy. No one should be able to ever create any kind of an asset in the cloud that doesn't have a tag that's associated with it. I need to know who created this asset, who do I charge back this asset to, or at least who do I show back this asset to? And if we go back to the conversation we had at the top of the session when we talked about how do you convert IT from a cost center to a revenue center? When you have the right governance and policies in place, that automatically transforms IT into a revenue center. Because when you're able to generate a report and break down who is using these resources, which department is using these resources, potentially which application these resources are built to, you're able to go to the business and say, as far as IT is concerned, we're using 5% of this budget. Everything else is being used by X department or Y department or Z department. So again, this is how you flip the script essentially and make IT a revenue center instead of IT being a cost center. You want to establish budgets, but I want to caution you about budgets. I've seen organizations that will put a budget in place and that will hold the applications team or the departments accountable for these budgets, and they basically cut their spend as soon as the budget is, as soon as they've met that budget. Well, not really sure you can do that. So what happens if they've met the budget and they maybe are going over the budget? What do? Shut down the application? That just doesn't work, right? So budgeting and forecasting are effective tools to alert you to where we're at, to maybe have conversations with these platform teams as far as how can we optimize. It's also important to have these budgets and forecasts in place because sometimes you might have the budget wrong. Maybe sometimes the platform teams, the engineers, developers have done all they can, but the budget's just too small. That then becomes a business conversation. The idea here is to not obsess over cost because there's only so much you can do. When you've put in the right governance, the right policies, when you're doing the right reporting, the right tagging, at some point there's a business conversation to be had. You've given me this much budget, but in order for me to run the application with the features that you've requested, I need X amount of budget. So the budget is not always used so that you can tighten your spending from the architects or from the IT side. It's also and should be used as a way to have a conversation with the business because maybe the expectations are not in sync with what you should be doing or what you should expect to do with something like this. Now, number 7 is storage lifecycle management. Now, storage is another one of these areas where oftentimes it's overlooked. We don't give storage enough of cost optimization, let's say. Most of these cloud providers have lifecycle management for their storage. So as you're moving data into an AWS, an S3, let's say, or a blob on Azure, whatever the case might be, you need to enable these lifecycle management capabilities with the right resource, with the right policies, with the right automation, so that if objects haven't been used for a certain amount of time, they get moved from the most expensive storage tier to a less expensive storage tier. And over time, you want them to move to an even lesser expensive storage tier. So don't use everything on S3 standard forever. You want to be able to move them between the different tiers of S3 all the way down to Glacier, all the way down to cold storage. What you get there is, yes, long-term retention of this data at a significantly reduced cost. It does come with caveats when you're trying to go access the data again or retrieve the data. But the idea here, if you haven't accessed something for 12 months or for 18 months or for 24 months, then the likelihood of all of a sudden you need it, it's low, right? Now, you still have access to this data, but when you do need this for whatever reason, maybe it's litigation, maybe you've lost something, you're able to wait. There's no urgency for you to retrieve the data immediately in real time. If it takes 2 or 3 hours to retrieve the data, depending on what you're looking for, that might be acceptable. But the idea is to constantly also look at your storage lifecycle management. If you don't have the right automation in place around this, then that is something that would be worth looking into from a cost optimization perspective. This is where, again, when you're looking at these third-party optimization tools, they should have features that will automatically manage or monitor your storage objects and alert you, hey, you haven't accessed this object in 6 months or a year. Advise you to move it to a different tier of storage. Those are things that should be looked into. Obviously, we also want to look into every instance, every virtual machine, and the type of storage that it's using. How much IOPS is it consuming? Is it using all of the IOPS that we have assigned to it? Is it not? Are we able to have a different configuration of the storage for the instance or the virtual machine that would lower the cost of storage? So as you're looking at all of these, whether it's your network bandwidth and the data transfers and how much ingress and egress you're doing, ingress is always going to be free, obviously, but how much egress are you doing? Now, egress costs in the past were always showstoppers. They were always expensive. And today, what I would say is egress costs should be one of those costs that you should be looking into. But if you're spending a lot of money on egress costs, then you haven't negotiated properly. Egress costs, for the most part, are under control because the cloud providers have recognized that for many organizations, egress costs have been showstoppers from moving certain applications. So I would say it's not uncommon for you to be able to negotiate 20 or 30 or even 40% reduction on your egress costs with these cloud providers, or depending on how you're doing it, sometimes with the co-location provider, if you're going through these Neatly locations, these co-locations, there's a lot of opportunity to optimize the egress traffic costs as well. Pay attention to costs also as you're going between regions because there's a small fee there, but it can add up. So storage lifecycle management, your egress and your network costs, those are things that you should be looking into as part of everything that we've discussed as well. Now, number 8 is implement chargeback and implement showback. Now, when we talk about chargeback is a little challenging because chargeback needs to be integrated within your ERP system. It's a lot more difficult to actually apply it because how are you going to move the money between departments? You're getting accounting involved in there. It becomes a little bit of a challenge. In my experience, a lot of customers have attempted chargebacks. Few customers have really succeeded in completely implementing chargeback. So if you examine or if you explore chargeback and find that it is either confusing or convoluted or too complex to implement, that's all right. As long as you have chargeback, the idea of chargeback within your mind, implement a showback. A showback is a lot easier than a chargeback because, again, you don't really need to integrate it into any ERP system, any accounting system for that matter. You simply are using it as a way to highlight some of the things that are, how is your bill being spent within your organization? Who is spending the bill, right? So when you're getting a bill from AWS, and I don't know if you've seen some of the AWS bills, but they're an eyesore. It's difficult to look at sometimes. But when you're looking at these very long Excel spreadsheets, you want to be able to somehow figure out, well, who's using these resources? If you don't enforce a tagging strategy from the get-go, from the beginning, then going back in and cleaning up your environment becomes difficult. It's something you still should do, but it becomes difficult because now you're going through hundreds, sometimes thousands of lines to figure out, well, who owns this resource? If you have the luxury of implementing a tagging strategy from the get-go, then you're, for the most part, going to have an easier way of reading the bill because you can sort by tags. And you want to have tags that you've pre-configured. You don't want to have the user put in whatever tag they want, right? So you want to have these pre-configured tags that they can choose from. And one of the other things that you want to do with tags is you want to ensure, you want to audit on a regular basis that they've chosen the right tag. And if you're doing this as part of the FinOps practice, as part of the Ops practice, which is to audit these assets on a weekly or monthly basis to make sure that the marketing department doesn't just tag the accounting department with a resource, I don't know, maybe intentionally or unintentionally to hide, where the spending is going. So make sure as you're doing showback, you emphasize tagging because tagging is going to be the differentiator for you. It is going to be what is going to allow you to, again, transform IT from being a cost center to being a revenue generating center, because when you take a step back, IT is not really spending any of the money on AWS. If you are, it's going to be a significantly small portion when compared to all of the other applications that the business is using. So your job, again, is to use the showback model to make business and technology indistinguishable. We are not spending this money. The business is spending this money, and here is how it is spending this money. That becomes a crucial point as you're doing this exercise. Now, to close out my session here, if you like this type of content, I have a couple of courses on how to build a cloud strategy on Udemy. It's on multi-cloud and on a cloud strategy masterclass. It has a ton of templates, whether it's Word documents or PowerPoint presentations, and I've got a ton of toolkits that are also available. So if you like this type of content, make sure you check out my course as well. And with that, I would love to take some questions.
Yeah, great presentation, Elias. Let's jump into the questions. And for everybody out there, don't forget to get those questions in. We have about 15 minutes, so we have plenty of time. Let's kick it off with a question from Lynn. Cloud cost optimization often involves a combination of technical, operational, and financial considerations. How do you recommend balancing these aspects to achieve effective cost management?
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is where that platform team that we talked about earlier, that's where that team comes into play. Now, it's all going to depend also on the type of application and what kind. Is it a COTS application, kind of an over-the-shelf type of application, or is it an application that is being developed? If it's an application that is being developed in-house, it is being designed, it's being architected, then the cost optimization should be weaved into that practice. Those developers are going to need to understand the cloud environment that they are deploying on, the capabilities of this cloud environment, and how to cost effectively deploy their application. It's also going to come down to your cloud strategy. Let me elaborate a little bit. If the cloud strategy insists on having mobility as part of the application development process, then you are reducing yourself to virtual machines, containers, and data. So what you're basically telling the developers is you have to develop an application that is completely containerized or completely on virtual machines, and then obviously you have the data. So the idea is portability. That is one of the only ways you will keep your application portable. But the downside to that is now your developers have to spend more money creating these services that are going to be put into containers. Now, if the idea is, no, we are able to leverage cloud native capabilities, PaaS capabilities, platform as a service capabilities, then the developer is going to develop the application taking into account services that are already available from the cloud provider. For example, they wouldn't need to rewrite a queuing service. They will simply use SQS from AWS. They might not need to rewrite notification services. They will use notification services from AWS. And the same thing would apply to databases and other services and capabilities. So as you're designing the application, depending on what the strategy is, what the goal of the application is, That is going to dictate what those architects, what those developers can do in order to cost optimize. And this is a conversation that you obviously want to have with the finance team, with the executives. Because again, if the strategy comes down to we want to be able to exit the cloud provider in a matter of weeks, then you have to reduce yourself to infrastructure as a service. This is, again, a decision that the business has to make, whether it's because of regulatory requirements, whether it's because of the industry that they're in, geopolitics, whatever the case might be. The decision has to come down to how are we going to develop the application. Everything else trickles down from that as far as how you're going to do cost optimization and what is available to you at that point. It's a great question.
Okay, moving on. Mary Lynn wants to know, what do you do if you are a small business and do not have a platform team?
Yeah. So a platform team is needed depending on the size of the organization, I agree. And I'm also not a fan of silos because I've spent my career breaking up silos, whether it's the networking team or the storage team or the virtualization team. Today we've got SRE teams and DevOps teams. So now there's FinOps teams. We're creating silos on the other side of governance. So if you're a small team and you don't have the ability to have a dedicated platform team, then what you do is you make sure that the team that you have has the right skill set. The one thing that you want to avoid is to have the existing team take on cloud responsibilities without the right capabilities. Because what they're going to do is they're going to take everything that they've learned on premises for the last 30 or 40 or 50 years and implement that into the cloud. If you do that, you're going to find that the cloud has zero cost benefits, zero cost optimization. If you don't want to create a platform team, you will need to make sure that the existing team has the skills. And you're going to have to break some habits. So instead of going to this team and saying, I've got a budget for training and certification, what kind of training do you want? If you take that approach, which is the approach that was taken with me 20 or 30 years ago, hey, Eli, we've got some money for training. What kind of training do you want? At that point, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go take some VMware training. You're leaving that up to me at that point. Instead, if you want to change this, if you want to change the culture, you're going to go to this team and say, I have budget for AWS training, or I have budget for Azure training. You can take this, because now you're trying to change their mindset. For conferences, do the same thing. Instead of approving the historical conferences they've gone to, only approve conferences for cloud, because if your objective is to enable them to learn about cloud, then you want them to network with like-minded individuals. You want them to attend these sessions. You want them to go through hackathons. You're trying to empower them, give them the experience needed in order to manage the environment. Now, here's what I'll also say. Sometimes culture and politics will come into play, and you'll find that the existing team maybe doesn't like cloud. There's cloud resistance, and they refuse to do this. You'll have to, again, shuffle the team up a little bit. At that point, you'll hire one or two individuals maybe from outside of the environment that have been there, that have done that will help the team migrate, move, change the mindset. This is not to say that the existing team is not going to have existing responsibilities or that the data center is going away anytime soon, but we can all admit that the data center is shrinking and their skill set has to evolve. Those that don't evolve will unfortunately be left behind, but you'll have to do everything you can to move them along. So if you can't develop a platform team, if a platform team isn't justified, if the workloads don't require development, then the existing team has to evolve, and you would have to make sure you help them evolve during the process. Great question, too.
Okay, this next question from Tim could probably be blown out into its own session talk, but let's see how you handle it with the time we have left. What are some points to consider when deciding which cloud provider to use?
How much time do we have, Chris? That's a really great question, and that's one of the lessons that I cover in my multi-cloud course. I'll give you a little bit. I'm not going to blow off the question. I'm going to give you some things to consider. When you take a look at these cloud providers, at least the top three, I'm talking AWS, Azure, and Google, you can make the argument that at least that 95% of the applications will pretty much work on all of these cloud providers. But there are areas where you can start to differentiate these cloud providers. For starters, If you have an application, for example, that requires very high degrees of availability, I would say go with AWS, and I would say that for a few reasons. AWS, from the get-go, from the beginning, has architected their regions with 2 or 3 or more availability zones in mind. And these availability zones are at least a mile apart. These availability zones, all of the services that are offered within this region support availability zones models. So we know that from an AWS perspective, there's a lot of consistency. We've tested this environment at scale across availability zones. We know that there is a physical distance between the availability zones. We know that all of the services within that region support availability zones. Now, the other cloud providers also have availability zones, but this is where, when you start to look at some of the technical differences, you start to see them. Let's take Microsoft. Microsoft, for example, has great availability in general within a single availability zone. So if you look at what they have within one data center, they've got the ability to do fault domains and update domains and all of these things, availability sets, etc. They've got great availability within the same data center. And sometimes you'll say, that's more than enough for me. But when you look at how Microsoft does their regions and availability zones, a lot of their regions have availability zones, but not all of the services that are in that region support all of the availability zones. So now you have to take a look at, make sure that the service you want is supported across availability zones if you're trying to have active across these availability zones. We know that there's physical separation, so that is a check mark that works for Microsoft. The problem is that Microsoft has a lot of variations in terms of how the regions are architected. That would be one area for you to take a look at when it comes to Microsoft. When it comes to Google, Google, again, from the get-go, has availability zones in every single one of their regions. The services support all availability zones. But with Google, for example, sometimes those AZs are on the same floor, separated by drywall. Sometimes they're in the same building, separated by floors. So here, the physical distance between the AZs comes into question. Now, they're addressing that. Not all of the regions are like that, but it is another thing that you would have to take a look at. So for me, when it comes to, hey, I'm looking for availability, I kind of default to AWS. If you throw in, hey, I'm looking for hybrid or multi-cloud, I tend to choose Microsoft and Google to a certain extent. Microsoft, because Microsoft has a relationship, for example, with Oracle, where they're interconnecting their regions. So it's a direct connect between Microsoft regions and Oracle regions. Not all of the regions are like that, but they interconnect the regions. And the idea behind it is you can use Oracle workloads on Oracle Cloud, and you can use everything else on Azure. We're giving you low latency, high bandwidth, bada bing, bada boom, you're off to the races. So when I have a need for multi-cloud, AWS doesn't really play nice with multi-cloud. Microsoft is pioneering that. Microsoft also, from a hybrid perspective, they have a lot of capabilities. AWS has some strong capabilities in terms of hybrid, but I'll give hybrid again to Microsoft, whether it's Arc, whether it's Stack, whether it's the fact that hybrid is built into all of their software, from Windows to SQL Server and Stretch clusters to Visual Studio, etc. So when it comes to hybrid, I'll put that in Microsoft's camp. When it comes to the edge, for example, they're all doing it very well, but I lean a little bit more towards Google. So you can start to see there are some technical differentiators. If you tell me, hey, I have an application that requires CIFS protocol or the SMB protocol, and I want to use it as a service, I would say go with Microsoft. If you say, hey, I've got it, I need NFS as a service, I would say go with AWS, because they were early to that. It's a really nice scalable service. So depending on the application and its technical requirements, there are some nuances where you can choose one provider versus the other. If it's a high-performance compute, maybe I'll say go with Spot instances on AWS or go with Spot instances on Google. Microsoft also has it, but it was a little bit late to the party. So there is criteria that would help you choose, but I would say in general, for most of the workloads, the three of them are pretty sufficient. Now you have to start to look at, what kind of support can I get? What kind of cost can I get? For example, from a support perspective, AWS's support is fantastic. From a cost perspective, I think Microsoft is kind of unbeatable with enterprise agreements, but you've got Google they'll go the distance. They'll play ball, basically, when it comes to cost. They're willing to win logos. They're willing to throw resources at you, whether it's technical resources and consulting or money. They'll throw it at you to help you get onto the Google platform. So I'm going to say, like I used to say when I was at my previous employer, it depends, but there are ways to differentiate and delineate between them.
Yeah, thanks for tackling that huge question. On a similar note, and you started to talk about it, what are the differences in cost between cloud providers?
So I would say if you look at it from on the face of it, there's really no difference. Like if you go put the website side by side and see the cost for compute or the cost for egress traffic or data transfer or databases, they're almost identical, almost identical. It's only when you start to apply these discount programs, these enterprise agreements, these contracts that you've negotiated, that you start to see some differences between them as far as cost. Because for AWS, you have to be at a certain amount of spend before you're really getting the enterprise agreement really kicks in and you're really feeling the difference. Microsoft, like I said, it's a little bit of an easier conversation because they already own the enterprise agreement. They're simply adding to it. I would say, and this is not based on data, just my experience, 9 out of 10 times they'll probably win if it just comes down to cost, just because of how much leverage they have. So on the face of it, they're very similar. When you start to apply the discount programs and the contracts, you'll start to see some start differences between them.
Okay, we got a couple of tools questions for you. Vic wants to know, are there any tools to monitor and manage cloud costs? And James also wants to know, but with regards to Azure.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of tools. I mentioned a few of them during the presentation. So as far as the third party, for example, you've got Cloudability, a very good tool. Flexera 1 it's a very good tool. VMware Cloud Health is an excellent tool. You have the cloud providers that have native capabilities. So for example, you mentioned Azure. Azure has Azure Cost Management and Billing. That's great. You've got Azure Advisor. Highly recommend that you use Azure Advisor, both in the free version and in the paid version. Take advantage of that. Google has cost management. AWS has a ton, right? I mean, AWS has tools sprawl. You obviously want to start with CloudWatch. That's going to help you monitor the environment, whether it's IaaS or PaaS. That's a very good starting point. They've got Cost Explorer that will help you with budgeting and simulating some of these costs as well. Highly recommend Cost Explorer. And then you also have Trusted Advisor on AWS, and there's a free version and there's a paid version. And I would recommend that you start with the free one, obviously, but also leverage the paid one. There's some really good insights that you can gain from that as well. This one is going to come down again to so when you're exploring these tools, the challenge with the native tools is, well, if you've got multi-cloud, which is what I'm advocating, now you've got 3 sets of tools that you have to learn and use. This is why when it comes to optimization in particular, cloud cost optimization, I recommend the third-party tools. Now, when you're looking at these third-party tools, you want to look at how easy is it to use this tool? What's my learning curve for a Cloudability or a Flexera or a Cloud Health or others? HP has some. I mean, there's a ton of these tools, right? So how easy is it to use? How easy is it to integrate, right? So you want to make sure that it can integrate with these cloud environments with relative ease. Where does it integrate? A lot of these tools will usually support the IaaS environment very well. So your virtual machines, your containers, your data, your serverless, all of those. They'll usually support those really well. But what you want to look at is how well do they support the platform services? Those are the ones where you want to focus on. So how easy is it to use? How easy is it to integrate? The security aspects of it? All of these things are things you want to take into account. How long will it take to deploy, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, again, when we're talking about cost, and this is the ironic thing, we're talking about cost optimization, but when you're buying a tool, you want to make sure that the cost of the tool is also competitive as well. So keep that in mind.
Okay, that's all the time we have for Q&A today. Elias, thanks for the great presentation.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Everyone, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Enterprise Cloud Costs, top tips, advice, and gotchas for managers looking ahead. Take a chance to check out those resources on your console provided by Zerto and Lacework, and we will be right back.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our our online summit. Sorry, it's our second session, Managing Cloud Costs in 2023 Expert Advice. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, Virtualization and Cloud Review, and AWS Insider, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsors, Zerto, the company that brings together disaster recovery and data protection in a single scalable solution, and Lacework, provider of a cloud security platform that empowers developers to fix risks before they hit production. Thanks to both of you guys for making this event possible, and thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator for the second of our 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, a quick reminder that each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way in the next few days. This session will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsors have provided some extra resources you won't want to miss. They're available now on your console. Also, check out the Resource Center for more information on our upcoming live 360 training conference in Orlando, Florida this November. With more than 170 sessions and 16 hands-on labs, this conference brings together the IT, developer, data, and cybersecurity communities for real-world practical information on a wide range of Microsoft and other products, technologies, and solutions. It's an awesome conference. You really should check it out. At the end of the summit, we hate to bug you guys, but you'll be asked to take a short survey. We know that you're busy, but we're hoping you'll take just a moment to give us some honest feedback on today's event. And last but not least, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a $500 Amex gift card. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our second session, Enterprise Cloud Costs, Top Tips, Advice, and Gotchas for Managers Looking Ahead. For this session, we've called on Joey D'Antoni, Principal Consultant at Denny Cherry and Associates. With more than 2 decades of experience at Fortune 500 companies, Joey is a well-known thought leader in cross-platform IT. He's both a VMware vExpert and a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. He has worked extensively on database platforms and cloud technologies, and he has a high level of expertise in performance tuning, infrastructure, and disaster recovery. He is one of our very favorite presenters. I know you're in for a great session. Take it away, Joey.
Thanks, John, and welcome, everyone. This is one of my favorite topics, so I'm really glad to get to be talking about it today. And just to give you a little background on my career, I've been consulting now for almost 10 years. But the last job I had before I was a consultant was working at Comcast Cable. And you can not throw tomatoes at me because I didn't have anything to do with like account cancellation or anything like that. But one of the things that was fun about working there was we had a lot of servers. And we didn't really know what they cost. And part of my role as an architect there was to figure that out. And so I had to build out my own costing model. And during that, we ended up, another project I got to work on there was building our own private cloud that worked a reasonably close facsimile to what, Amazon and Azure have. So in that role, I got to gain a lot of experience on like how things are costed and why things are costed. And I've also had the good fortune of kind of working with Microsoft on a lot of Azure projects really early as an MVP to provide feedback. So I've learned a lot about how things are costed and how things work. And it's kind of interesting just from the cloud perspective to figure that out, but it also ties into how you build things. So this session is really kind of designed, and as it's in the title, it's scoped towards enterprise customers and kind of management. A lot of these same techniques will apply for smaller customers, and I get to work with a lot of both. So I work with small customers and very large customers at the same time. And a lot of the fundamental things I'm going to talk about are going to apply to smaller customers. Some of the scale and policy things I'm going to talk about might not need to happen. Might not need to happen in a smaller firm. You don't have to worry as you know who all the people are who have access to create resources in your cloud environment are. You might not have to create policy around that. But one of the first things you need to do is figure out your cost model for your app. And these slides are all from a training I've done for a very large corporation. So I kind of handpicked some of the slides I wanted to choose out of it. But one of the things I do in this training that we're not going to be able to do today just because of logistics, but I give them a sample application, and it's you need to build this drone delivery application on Azure. And I give them very, very kind of vague requirements, and I don't really give them a service level agreement. I just kind of say, you want it to be up most of the time. You want it to survive, potentially survive the loss of a data center. And it should have these components in it, and it should scale. Go ahead and build it and price it out. And one of the really kind of interesting things about that exercise, and the reason why I leave that exercise so open-ended when I do the training, is you can build that environment out for like $100 a month, or you can build it out for $15,000 a month. And because the requirements are so vague, neither of those are terribly wrong. So I really like to see where people come out in that exercise. As part of that, though, one of the things you have to capture are your cost requirements for your cloud endeavors. And whether this is just a straight migration where you're doing kind of a lift and shift or moving some apps into the cloud, you need to capture your business workflow. The business workflow is vastly underrated. I know as technologists, we like to talk about tech. We like to talk about cool new things. I geek out about various storage performance of different platforms. So I totally get that, and I really do like to nerd out. But where this comes down is understanding the business workflow and what the business needs are, because this is really going to drive the other three things here. Is this application or is this stack of applications really critical to your business, or is it like an IT monitoring solution? And you need to make those determinations, and that's going to help you design your app. Because just a basic example on my drone delivery app, if drone delivery is my core business there, I'm going to err on the side of sizing things a little bigger than I want them to be, or auto scaling more aggressively if I'm doing something that auto scales, because that's my core business. If it's like some log processing thing on the back end that's not really my core business, I may err on the side of reducing the size of some of those resources. So the business parts of this are kind of important. Compliance and regulatory. I worked in pharmaceutical. I worked in electric utility. My wife works for a financial services firm. I am vastly familiar with the impact of compliance and regulatory rules. I find these things, especially in the cloud, because all the vendors have done a really great job of getting certified on all the various major audit criteria. This isn't so much a cost. It can be a cost because sometimes you have to have redundancy because of requirements, but that's a little bit less common. But this can be more of a delay, and it's not typically so much of a delay with your regulatory agencies because of the work the cloud vendors have done, but it can be a delay with your own QA and compliance people, and that's something that can be a challenge. Security. This is one of those kind of interesting places. I find smaller organizations that as they move into the cloud, they'll spend a little bit more on security and they'll end up being a lot more secure. Just because a lot of the tools they have that are available to them in the cloud weren't necessarily available to them in an on-prem environment, and they end up with much greater security. With enterprises, it's a little bit more challenging because just the size of the enterprise, the number of weird applications they have that have weird third-party dependencies. Maintaining security is kind of more the goal there, and maintaining your current state and maybe getting some improvements is also something. But it's also something at enterprise scale that it's going to cost a lot more. A good example of that is Azure Active Directory, right? Azure Active Directory is Microsoft's identity. Excuse me. As an MVP, I will get slapped for Microsoft for not calling it the new name, which is Microsoft Intra Identity, because Azure Active Directory was confusing or something. But anyway, if you buy the expensive version of that, it's like $10 a user a month. If you have 50 to 100 users, that's not a lot of money. If you have 40,000 users, that suddenly becomes a lot of money, even if you're a very big company. So security is something you need to account for and plan into your architecture. And how you do that is going to vary depending on your size. Finally, availability. This is something, once again, that's a business problem. It's something I absolutely nerd out about. Do I want to build a really cool application that can survive the loss of multiple clouds and stay up? Yes, I do. Does my business necessarily need me to do that? In most cases, probably not. And as you're designing an architecture, availability always ties back to the business, and it's something you need to get executive business sign off on. And that doesn't mean necessarily your CT or IO. It means your CEO or your COO, somebody who's not a techie. And always, that conversation is going to go down like, yeah, this application needs to be up all the time. It needs to survive a nuclear war, and yada, yada, yada. It needs to run cross-continent. And then you're like, okay, cool, that's going to cost $2 million a month. And then they're like, okay, can we knock that down to surviving like a missile attack on another continent? And invariably, you meet a happy medium where you reach the needs of the application. That's going to tie in. We're going to talk a lot about that with performance too, and how you scale things. Those kind of decisions can make significant differences in the cost of cloud. So things like availability, running a whole hot site in another cloud or in another region in your application effectively doubles your cost, and nearly always. I mean, there's some things you can do like downscale things, but it's going to almost double your cost. So those are important decisions to make, and you want to get your business to have understanding around them. So another thing that Corey Quinn, who's an AWS expert around costing, has this really great quote called, saying, if you show me your AWS bill, I can gather what the architecture of your application is. That is nearly always the case, except for one cost management project I was on where it was a very large company and they were spending entirely too much money. And I think their goal in their architecture was to use like all of the products in one architecture. I can usually pretty easily tell what kind of application it is and what your patterns are just by looking at your bill. So if you're migrating legacy systems, in the last session, it was mentioned, about how if you just do a straight lift and shift of VMs and you don't make any changes, you aren't going to save any money. And that's definitely accurate. Where you can get some benefits and where we see things with customers is there are some types of legacy systems, and I'll give an example of like if you're on an old version of SAP or you're on that isn't as tightly integrated with the cloud. I think some of their newer stuff is better than just moving VMs. But if you have to move a bunch of like old VMs into the cloud, if that's the only thing you're moving into the cloud, it doesn't make any sense. But if you're holistically moving your entire IT infrastructure into the cloud, it can make sense to have some things that just aren't really modified at all. They're just moved kind of as is. The second part here is, are you building a new service? And we see that, especially with our enterprise customers, we see definitely a mix of these things, right? Where they'll have legacy systems that end up in the cloud where you have like this 20 terabyte data warehouse, but you're also maybe building new online ordering systems in the cloud. Or are you trying to design a better architecture for an existing application? And those are all different approaches, and they're going to have different kind of cost modeling structures in them. And the one thing you want to do, and this is always difficult because developers and product managers always want to build, but you want to plan, understand what services you want to choose. You'll probably have to change along the way, and that's not a big deal. Changing services happens. But you want to plan and figure out what the costs are going to be. And more importantly, not just what the costs are going to be for your first month, but if the app becomes popular and you need to scale, how does that work? If we need to downscale, how much can we bring the cost down? Those are all kinds of things that you want to do in planning for your cost management for building these sorts of applications. One of the things that I really like to talk about and I kind of harp on, and I know AWS has it. I'm less familiar with their, and I assume Google has it, is policy, and it's something we do in Azure. And policies, budgets, and cost management tools all kind of work together. And if you're not familiar with cloud policy, it's very much like if you've ever worked with Active Directory group policy, where you say users can't do these things. That's kind of what we do. Just to give you a basic example of a policy that we have within DCAC, you can't create a new Azure resource group in DCAC's tenant unless you put a created date and a client name on it. Very basic policy that I created that once in a blue moon will cause me hassle. I'm looking at you, Databricks, by one of our consultants not being able to build something they need, but it gives us a baseline level of governance. The other extreme to that is I've worked with a training vendor where they build labs, right? And you have students using labs, and as you can imagine, that can get very expensive very quickly. And those labs are completely locked down by policy, so that if the lab says you need to deploy this D1 one-core VM, that's the only VM you can deploy. That's what the policy is, right? The policy says deny any VMs that are not this D1. So policies can really help you with cost management. And typically what you're going to see around these policies is you'll knock off a bunch of SKUs. And we'll get into some kind of more details around how you do that later in the slides. But this is like a lot of firms will use policy to limit the regions people can deploy to for various regulatory regions, but also the SKUs. I mean, there are some very, very expensive cloud SKUs. You maybe want to limit people from even accidentally doing something like that. You also want to look at setting budget alert levels and associated actions. So budgets are really important. Budgets are simply, you define that we expect this service to cost $20,000 a month. The reason why that's so important is so that if you set a budget of $20,000 a month and in the first 2 days of the month your spend blew that budget, then you have time to react and you know what those kinds of things are. You also want to identify acceptable boundaries for scale, redundancy, and performance against cost. This is kind of what I talked about earlier about the priority of a given application. This is basically what it comes down to. The classic example we like to use of where you might be able to downscale something is if you have, say, a workload that has to be processed in an 8-hour window overnight. It doesn't really matter if that workload runs at 100% CPU during that batch window, because that's all that VM or service's job is to do, is to run that process overnight. If that was a system where, like, additionally, beyond processing that, you needed to have users accessing it, obviously you'd have to scale it more. But understand those things. Understand your security cost, and then finally, identify unrestricted resources. We talk about a lot of the benefits of the cloud, and a lot of the cloud vendors like to build these auto-scale solutions, and they swear up and down that people like variable pricing. I haven't run into too many of my customers that really like variable pricing. It can be beneficial if you don't really use the service. Where it's bad is some of these services. And on my next slide, I have some examples of some of these. And I don't mean to call out Cosmos DB, because I think that team has built a pretty awesome database service. But we always, and admittedly, some of the costing of the service has improved. But in the early days of the service, we like to joke that it costs somewhere between $400 a month, $400 and all of your money per month. That's what it costs. And it's completely dependent on your developers writing efficient code against your Cosmos DB as to whether it's $400 or all of your money. So keep that in mind. Anything that auto scales can get really expensive. And a lot of these auto scaling features are really beneficial. So they're not a negative, but it's just, you need to really monitor them. And this is where having those budgets comes in. And all this stuff kind of ties together, right? Like a web app can auto scale and you can have multiple instances of that app. And that's going to cost a lot of money. But if you really are having that much business, it's not a bad thing, and you want your customers to be able to respond, get quick responses from your hardware. Serverless workloads are also something that, in spite of them being perceived as very cheap, can be very expensive, because frequently on these serverless workloads, you pay for time used, and you pay that at a higher cost per second than if you were using like a VM or dedicated compute 24/7. So you pay for that flexibility. These serverless workloads work great, but they don't work great when you are using them all the time. Well, they still work pretty great, but they cost a lot more. Large VM workloads without reservations are something that can be really expensive. Reservations or savings plans, I should caveat that. We'll talk about that on the next slide. Storage is also something that should be cheaper. And storage is kind of an interesting place. So one of the things, we're going to talk about reservations and savings plans, and those are by far the biggest way to save money in the cloud. You don't really see those reservations or savings plans offered on cloud storage. The reason for that, frankly, is based on my understanding, the margins are a lot lower. So if you're using cloud storage correctly and you're taking advantage of things like S3 and automated tiering and blob storage in Azure and taking advantage of some of those things, you can save a lot of money, especially compared to like enterprise class on-prem storage. However, where storage can get kind of expensive is especially block storage or VM storage, EBS in AWS or managed disk in Azure. Some of these tiers can be really expensive. So if you're needing some of the ultra high performance storage like UltraDisk in Azure or IO1, 2 in Amazon, this can be really expensive. So high performance storage can be very, very, very expensive. Finally, one point that a lot of folks don't necessarily think about when they deploy cloud storage, and this doesn't really apply to VM disk because this is baked into the cost of those, but it does apply to the object stores like S3 and Azure Blob. Those services have not just the cost of your storage as part of the dimensions that make up your monthly bill for that service. Reads and writes are also part of that. So if you're, say, serving a web asset, like a video or an image directly from S3, the number of reads and writes you get are factored in your bill. There are tiers of storage, so there's like hot, cold, and archive, or Glacier in Amazon. Those cheaper tiers of storage can have very high usage costs. So it's important you understand your storage patterns there and use those tiers appropriately. So even though hot storage may be more expensive overall per terabyte, your overall costs for serving things from that storage can be very, very much cheaper. Resource reservations and savings plans. So one of the things that, and this slide's a little bit Azure specific, but this is going to apply to AWS as well. One of the changes we've seen in recent years is that AWS and Amazon are trying to move out of the reservation business and into the savings plan business. And I really don't know the rationale of what that is, but conceptually, these are the same idea. You're committing to give your cloud vendor money over a 1 to 3 year period. And in exchange for that money, they'll give you a really good discount on computing services. And typically these discounts can range anywhere from around 30% to around 70%. So it's a very big, big savings. And this is probably a lot of times you'll hear folks that maybe aren't super experienced with cloud costs talk about how to save money in the cloud, and they'll be like, oh, we can power down our dev environments and save money. And yeah, that's valid, and you can do that. But in the grand scheme of a cloud bill, it's not everything. These are like where you're really going to save money. For virtual machines, Azure SQL Database, lots of service offerings have savings plans associated with it. Reservations can be for up to 5 years, although typically they're most commonly 1 and 3. You can pay them up front or month to month. And one of the big differences here between reservations and savings plans is reservations were traditionally connected to a region, at least in Azure, and I think in AWS as well. With savings plans, you get flexibility. So you're just paying for a service that you're going to consume. So for example, if I had a reservation, and they were pretty narrowly specific for a VM, if I had a reservation for an M series VM, which is a high memory VM in Azure, and I had, 128 cores of M series VMs reserved in US East, if I wanted to exchange that, I couldn't really exchange it to another region. And I could exchange it to another VM series, but it was limited. The way savings plans work is I just agree to buy 128 core VM in Azure for 3 years, and I can move those things around. So reservations are going to be going away, I think, at least in Azure. I don't know if they're going to go away in Amazon, but they have been kind of replaced by savings plans as part of that. So this T-shirt size model kind of ties back into policy. We talked a little bit about policy earlier, and this is something that we kind of did at Comcast, and it's something I've run into at a number of large-scale customers where you build out this model. And this is definitely an enterprise thing. So when we talk about some of these things, and I did differentiate between enterprise and smaller organizations, this isn't something you're going to do if you're a small organization. Because if you're a small organization, you're going to probably evaluate each dollar you spend in the cloud as you deploy things. Large organizations, especially where you have large development orgs and you have cloud infrastructure teams that are managing the cloud platform, this is something you may do where you have standards for kind of how people build applications on the cloud. You build these T-shirt size models where you consider specific VMs and sizes for platform as a service resource. And this has a few goals. You want to minimize your exposure to very expensive resources, but also it helps you make costs more predictable. And it also helps you help your developers make their costs be more predictable. So it gives you an idea of expected performance and cost requirements. And it also helps in your, as a cloud architecture team, understanding of an on-demand consumption model. So this is one of the things when we built out our private cloud environment. So we took all that information we had that I kind of gathered over a couple of years of what our hardware at Comcast cost, and that rolled in everything, right? So that rolled in the price of the hardware of the data center. Cloud makes this simple because you just get a bill. But we rolled all that into our private cloud stuff, and we were able to assign costs based on these T-shirt sizes. The other thing that was really helpful to us when we built that, and this is probably helpful to you as a cloud management team, it makes your planning of things like savings plans a lot more efficient, because you can more easily predict how many cores of services you're going to use, as opposed to, we don't know, whatever our developers say we're going to build, and we don't have a good idea of that. So you can kind of do things a little bit more predictably. It just kind of helps you help your developers and better plan. And there are probably always going to be exceptions for this rule. And if you do something like this, or policy, I should say, you do need to have, an exception process. But you want teams to try to stick to these kind of T-shirt size things, so your cost can be more predictable. I talked a little bit about this earlier, and this is something I think myself and cloud vendors kind of disagree on. There are two kinds of pricing of various cloud things, and I alternate between calling them fixed and variable cost and fixed and consumption model. But the basic idea is we have fixed cost resources. Good examples of fixed cost resources are things like single VMs and VM storage. I can tell you that in Azure, a premium managed disk costs somewhere, depending on your region, between $120 and $145 a month for 1 terabyte with 5,000 IOPS and 250 megabytes per second of throughput. No matter how much you use that disk, if you use it none, or if it's at 100% of its availability for the entire month, that disk costs you that $120 to $145. Fixed cost is really good for some things. Fixed cost is typically going to be beneficial for workloads where you know you're going to be using them a ton. Variable cost workloads are for things like autoscale, and this slide incorporates a few different design patterns where you can see our user load is that kind of dark blue line, and then if we design for autoscale, or we use a serverless pattern, or we use a queue-based load leveling pattern where we make our process asynchronous, we can see that queue-based load leveling process, which is the gray line at the very bottom there, is the most efficient. And then, of course, if we design our cost for peak, we can see it at 600. That's one of our more expensive model here. Really, this is something that's you just need to be aware of, and it's going to depend on the nature of your system. Would I like to design every system so that it uses a queue-based load leveling process? I would, because it would mean I don't really have to do any synchronous transactions, and I don't have to design for really high performance. And by all means, systems that can be asynchronous should be asynchronous, because it's a much more efficient design pattern computationally, and much more predictable too. It's going to definitely scale a lot better. My databases will all be a lot happier if we're processing transactions in the asynchronous manner. But it's not practical for every application. You can do that for some things, but like bank transactions have to be synchronous. You don't want to wait for your deposit to show up. Those are all sorts of kind of design patterns you have to take in mind in your application. So this is kind of just a general approach that I like to take where we start. So kind of starting with the top right here, where you keep within cost constraints. So the important thing when you're designing an application is to build a budget, build a realistic budget. Don't try to undersize things. One of the lessons I learned when we virtualized everything in the late 2000s was that you can't just go, oh, hey, we virtualized this so we can cut the number of cores and RAM in half. Compute doesn't really work that way. You need to design your cloud solutions to perform well. Otherwise, your users aren't going to be happy, or at least meet the users or processing needs. So set that cost constraint, try to stay in that boundary. You want to aim for scalable cost, pay for what you consume. Where you can use consumption-based models and they work for you, it can be a good solution because it's going to meet your needs. It's an important thing to kind of monitor and optimize, and then right resources, right size. I talked a little bit earlier about this project, but I'll give you a little more detail on it. I mentioned a project where I was working with a large enterprise where they had like every service possible in their architecture, and I didn't really know why. I also called that project, jokingly, the tender project, because all their team of consultants did was swipe right on everything. If you don't get the swipe right joke, it's Tinder's a dating app, and I think you swipe right. I've been married 24 years, so I'm not 100% sure on this. I think you swipe right to eliminate people, maybe, I don't remember. In the cloud, when you swipe right, it increases the size of your resources. So when you swipe right, the amount of compute you get goes up, but also your bill goes up, to the point that this bill was like $30 million a month for this project. It wasn't even the company's entire cloud bill. They had swiped right on everything. Don't do that. I know we'll talk a little bit I talked a little bit more about turning stuff off. That helps, but right-sizing resources helps the most. And then planning and getting savings plans on those. And then finally, you want to monitor and optimize. This is an ongoing process, right? And it's one of the things about the cloud that is really different from on-prem. For the most part, I find it's a lot easier to reclaim resources that you're not using, at least within the cloud. You may have to argue with people in your organization. But staying on top of that, monitoring those budgets are really important, especially when you deploy things. Because one of the things you really want to avoid is getting, whether it's your CFO or your finance team, getting them surprised with a very large bill when you were expecting not a very large bill. And one of my customers is really great about this. Like, because in their subscription, we do a lot of automation around powering things on and off because it's customer facing. And like, if that automation breaks at all, they have tight monitoring around their budget. So like, I'll get an email, hey, the spend on this is up. What's going on? Can you check the automation to see if it worked? Having that level of cost budgeting may not be necessary for all applications, but it's really good to have because it does eliminate surprises. Monitoring and analytics is so important. I really can't emphasize this enough. If you're not monitoring what you're spending, you don't know what you can save. You don't necessarily know what VMs, and in the session before, the various advisors were mentioned, and they're really good. They do a good job. They don't always tell you things beyond VMs, so they don't necessarily have the intelligence that some of the third-party tools have, but they're a really good baseline for looking at things. There are a lot of places that you're using the wrong things, and this is stuff that changes over time too. So one of the places where we've helped save customers money is as more powerful CPUs have come into the cloud, we've actually been able to just move to new VM types or core types, depending on their service, and reduce their costs by not necessarily halving, but reducing the number of CPUs they have. Those cost management tools can be really helpful and show you where you want to put those emphases on things like savings plans. And then regularly review your billing statements to understand where your money is being spent. It's not necessarily as simple as just looking at the most expensive thing and then trying to figure out how to cut that. In fact, from a IT perspective, one of the things I always like to do is make sure, at least on my most expensive resources, I have resource locks so that they can't easily be deleted by somebody who just got the bill and was like, why does this database server cost $24,000 a month? Because it houses our ERP system and that's what we need to run our business. But it really does help to look at your bills, and there are various tools. I know, like with Azure, there's Power BI. You can ingest your bill into Power BI, and it will help you understand that. There are some tools where you can just look at your spend within the portal. Likewise, in the AWS console, there are like 20 various AWS tools that help you ingest and digest your bill. But those are all things that just taking a look at those kinds of services are really, really helpful. So be efficient. So waste can show up in the cloud in several ways. And this is something I do always kind of like to look at. If you have a virtual machine that's always 90% idle, is that something that could maybe be replaced by a service that just triggers, like a function as a service or a logic app or something like that? Or can the machine be powered on once a day to do its thing? I've built some kind of novel things in my time in working in the cloud, and one of the things I built is we have a process that has to run once a day to populate a customer database in AWS from a database in Azure. And this process has to involve a VM because it's a goofy architecture, and I have to have a VM in place. So once a day, I have an automation job that runs, and it checks the state of that VM, and it assumes that it's powered off, and it checks for that. And if that VM's powered off, what it does is changes the disk on that VM from standard to premium. I'll explain why in a second. Then powers on the VM, and then also activates another job that checks the status of this process. The process, the command that runs the process is asynchronous. So it will complete, that statement will complete before the process is finished. So I have to have something else that checks it. The checker script, what it does is it checks every 10 minutes or every 15 minutes to see when the process is done. And then when the process is done, it powers down the VM. And after the VM is powered down, you can reduce the disk to standard. The disk needs to be premium to run the process, but a cool trick I learned from another architect is that you can change disks from premium to standard in Azure when the machine's powered down, and you don't, because you're not really using the disk, so why pay for the expensive disk when you're not using it? That took me a couple of hours to write for this customer, but this is a process that runs every day, and it saves them all the money. So that's something to keep in mind. Understand cloud licensing models, and this is kind of specifically a Microsoft thing, but in Azure you can bring licenses for Windows and SQL Server. So don't make sure you're not paying twice for your licenses. Understand storage and object storage and how you're using that data. So if you have data that you're only keeping for regulatory reasons, consider putting that on an archival tier. So one of the things we like to do is manage performance efficiency, and there's scale up and scale out models. And in general, I like to say that scaling out is generally cheaper than scaling up. Like buying a bunch of little things is cheaper than buying one big thing in the cloud. But the big thing you want to understand with here from an architectural perspective is to understand what your growth pattern is going to be and what the costs are going to be. I've worked with a couple of applications where and this is kind of funny to say, but the application was designed in a way that they just had to keep buying bigger and bigger hardware. And even in an on-prem environment, if you have to keep buying bigger and bigger pieces of hardware, that's going to get really expensive because the cost of hardware isn't linear. And then you're also going to probably reach a point where you can't buy any more hardware. The same kind of rules apply in the cloud. You can buy really, really big VMs, like 416 cores with 12 terabytes of RAM, but you really want to understand that design pattern, and just scaling up your VMs isn't a good design pattern. So figuring out a scale out methodology is something that's really important kind of early in your life. Then finally, before we summarize things, cost management principles that I like to apply. Planning. So planning just means plan before you build, and planning that includes knowing what things are going to cost and having expectations around what that budget for that application is going to be. And even, like I was just saying, what that scale pattern is going to be. Visibility. You want to know what those costs are from day to day, and you want to be alerted if they're suddenly out of bounds, right? You want to know before you have to tell your boss, or before your boss gets the bill. If you tell your boss on the third day of the month that, hey, this budget's going to blow out because all these users are using our app, but it's driving all these sales, that's an easier approach. Accountability, and this isn't really meant to be in a negative way, but you do want to know which teams and organizations are responsible for your cloud spend. At Comcast, we had this one app that was 15% of our entire infrastructure cost. And it took me 2 years to prove that because we didn't really have a showback model to be able to prove that. It's a lot easier to do that in the cloud. Optimization, you want to optimize. You don't want to overallocate resources and kill things. And you also don't want to have a bunch of idle resources. So this is something that you'll continue to evolve over time. In iteration, this is an iterative process. You're not going to be able to do it all in one day. So managing your costs is something that you're going to continue to do over time, and it's a changing target, right? You're not going to be able to see it all in day one or day two or day three. In summary, managing cloud costs is and can be a full-time job, especially for a very large organization, because large organizations, not just the total spend, but the breadth of cloud bills are very complicated. I think one of the biggest challenges around taking advantage of multi-cloud architectures, although a lot of large organizations do that, is they require deep understanding of pricing and models. For kind of basic resources like VMs and storage, the pricing is relatively consistent between clouds, and the pricing models are also relatively consistent. As soon as you start to get away from those, you can start to see high degrees of variation in pricing and in the models for what things cost. So that's one of the other unstated challenges of multi-cloud. Your cloud bill is your architecture. When I look at your bill, I can tell you what kind of app you have. And then but building scale costs money, but it shouldn't cost all of your money. If the budget for your app at different scales starts to look like that hockey stick approach, you might want to step back and take a look at how you can redesign your app. Because if you have this sharp upward curve after a certain point, not going to be a great happy day when you reach that curve. And then finally, this should be an ongoing and iterative process. You should be able to continue to evolve your resources, pay attention over time. Things change in the cloud, like this whole switch from reservations to savings plans isn't something that I would have necessarily expected 2 or 3 years ago, but it's a pleasant surprise because it does bring us a little bit more flexibility. And I think just to add on to that one final point, you need to stay as a manager or architect, you need to stay learning because the cloud vendors do change the way they price things, they change the services that are available, and that can either save or cost you money, and pay attention. Well, that was fun. John, do we have any questions? And if you're in the audience, just drop any questions you have in the Q&A box. I'm happy to take some questions while we're here.
We do have a few questions. We've got one here from Tori. Hi, Tori. The question is, when does auto-scaling resources make sense?
There are a lot of workloads where auto-scaling things can make a lot of sense. Anything that's customer-facing, where you have users interacting with your website, especially for organizations that are seasonal. So like if you're a retailer and you know the week after Thanksgiving is going to be the biggest week of the year in terms of online sales, having those sorts of things be able to auto-scale can be really important. The big thing you want to monitor for, because one of the things about auto-scaling that's a little bit, it's great, it meets your needs. It can quickly auto-scale your cost as well. Because if you think about it, when we talk about things like, the main things we really talk about auto-scaling are web servers or customer-facing servers. And those are typically, VMs that have a decent cost associated with them. And if you're multiplying that cost by 5 or 10 for a long period of time, that can be really expensive. So you always want to know what the scale back rules are, and you want to monitor that auto scaling so you don't know what they are, or you know what they are. Excuse me.
Fascinating. Okay, we've got one here from James who's wondering: is the script you used to automate virtual machines turning on in Azure for a certain process available on GitHub?
It is. I just need to find it. Yeah. It is in the DCAC GitHub, and I don't know. I'll put it in our chat. I don't know if anybody can share that to the audience, but yeah, that script is out there. And it's pretty basic. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get that link. I think Victoria's out there getting that link. Okay. All right. Here's another question. This one's from Vic, who's wondering, what are some common examples of runaway costs?
My favorite one is every project, every cloud project I've ever been on, and I have friends that work at this company, and I think they make a great product, but every runaway cloud project I've been on has involved Databricks as their ETL solution. Databricks, if you don't know, it's a Spark as a service thing. It's one of those things that can like blindly auto scale in the background. So it will scale. If you don't put limits in, it will scale to meet the requirements of your jobs. That's something that can get really expensive really fast. So Databricks is one, and it's really anything that uses unbound resources and uses them in a heavy way. I've seen Cosmos DB get really expensive for customers. Aurora on the Amazon side has a very similar pricing model. So just be on the lookout for those resources that auto scale, and then you're using them heavily, because that's kind of the Venn diagram of where things are bad. Because frequently it's when you're using. Almost all these resources have ways where you can buy them full time, and they're if you're using them very heavily, it's cheaper to buy them that way.
That's great advice. Okay, we've got one here from Rakesh, who's wondering, what is the best option to go with savings plan or reserved instance?
I think if I was buying things now, I'd pretty much only go with savings plans. I think reservations maybe get you a couple extra points of savings. But my understanding, this came up in something that somebody I was talking to a couple weeks ago. I think reservations, at least on the Azure side, might be going away completely, and it's just going to be savings plans. Microsoft tends to move pretty slowly when they kill those consumer offerings like that. But as long as a savings plan is available for your service, like the only reason why I would go for a reservation over a savings plan now is if savings plans weren't available for a given service, but they were available for, but a reservation was available. Savings plans let you just be more flexible between regions and service and tiers. Like you don't have to call, like Microsoft was pretty good about, and AWS as well, about letting you exchange those reservations between VM types, but now you don't even have to deal with that. You can just switch that.
Fascinating. Okay, thank you. Here's one from Walter, who's wondering, how do you prevent bottlenecks from overwhelming your application and your users?
That's always a challenge. So, whenever you're designing any sort of system or application, one of the goals is to know where the bottlenecks are and anticipate where they're going to be and then where the next bottlenecks are going to be. And this is something that, especially as you move applications to the cloud, is a challenge. In the very early days of the cloud, we saw a lot of issues around storage performance. We still see that. But now, in some cases, there can be network constraints. So when you're designing an application, it really helps to sit in a room with the team of, architects, devs, and system administrators to talk about just the various ways that data is going to flow through that app and where it's going to hit a bottleneck. And then, since we're talking about cost, I mean, that's kind of general performance tuning stuff that you should do. But since we're talking about cost and cloud, okay, we want to eliminate that bottleneck. How are we going to do it, and what's it going to cost? Does that mean recently I was working on something for a vendor, and I was doing some testing, and a third-party storage offering in AWS performed a lot better than the native EBS storage, and this vendor wanted me to evaluate, can you get the performance that good on EBS? And I could by increasing the tier of the storage, but it drove my storage cost up like 8x. So it was a pretty, I can't really name any of the products there, sorry, but it was a really huge difference. And that's one of those examples of like a hockey stick thing where you really want to understand that and how you can avoid those sorts of problems.
Okay, first, thanks, Marilyn. Appreciate the heads up there, the shout out, so to speak. Okay, now we've got one from Barry, who's wondering, what are some common examples of runaway costs?
I mentioned Databricks earlier. Something I haven't mentioned at all that I feel like I should have is network egress cost. This seems to come up a lot more on the AWS side than the Azure side, which surprises me because in some ways the costs are lower on the AWS side. But network egress, basically what that means is all the data you put in the cloud is free into the cloud. All the data you pull from the cloud is metered and costs money. Depending on the nature and the architect, there are ways to architect around this problem. You can use compression, but it is something where I see a really common we like to call them, the term I've used in white papers and stuff before is boundless cost, which is a simple way of saying it can cost you as much money as you can count. So something you always want to be aware of, and that's one of those places where like designing your app and setting an expected budget for an application or service is really important because you can monitor those costs and alert in the event that the costs start to run away.
Fascinating. Looks like that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much, Joy. That was awesome.
Thanks, Sean.